Well, your child is not allowed to sit through an assembly with the Lord's Prayer being said in Canada, but they are allowed to participate in a spiritual ritual of sorts called smudging, which is popular in the Indigenous culture. At least that was the decision that was made in a 2020 case over just that. But is that about to change? I'm going to give you the latest update for the appeal to that matter. Drea Humphrey here with Rebel News, and some of you may be familiar with this story. In 2015, a BC mom went to her children's school to try to get a better understanding about the smudging ceremony that was going to take place for her children, and only found out that it was too little too late. Her children had already taken part in it without her fully knowing and understanding what it was, and she went to the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms to help try to defend her rights for her belief that her religious freedoms were infringed upon in that situation. Now, the courts came down with a ruling, said no, they are not. They agreed with the school board's point of view, which was that this is simply just learning about different cultures. Now, what is smudging if you're not familiar with it? Well, there's different variations of the definition. I'll read you one right now by the Indigenous Corporate Training. It says that smudging is a sacred smoke created from burning medicinal or sacred plants, and it is an aspect of many cultures and religions all over the world. In North America, it is a practice common to Indigenous people and is called smudging. Now, many, but not all Indigenous cultures in Canada smudge, but they may have different beliefs associated with the smoke and different ceremonies and protocols. Now, what are those different beliefs? Well, they vary. You can see in other definitions, they will include words like ritual, which as defined here, commonly takes place in different religions. Some other definitions will talk about how it's a spiritual cleansing of sorts, and it's some way to connect with the deceased and ward off bad spirits. I had a similar dilemma, actually. I was reporting about a homeless encampment that had taken over much of a public park in Vancouver, only to be told that myself, as a Black Christian Indigenous woman, had to partake in a spiritual ritual of stuff by the encampment's leaders, or else I couldn't walk any further.
But first, we need you to do protocol at our sacred fire.
Oh, okay. Okay, so what is that?
That's putting tobacco in as an offering to the sacred fire.
But yeah, I'd have to know a lot more about doing a tobacco offering in a fire.
Then you want to go.
Sorry?
Then you want to go.
Then I want to go.
Yeah, you don't want to be here.
Because I won't do
This is a community of people that have all made the same choice to be here. And if you don't want to do the same thing, then I suggest you don't want to be here.
Now, I don't know about you, but I believe that I was created with free will and I shouldn't be compelled to do anything like that, especially in a public park of all places. But after taking some time, I found myself in a certain situation as well where I wasn't pressured. I wasn't told, no, you're not welcome here if you do not take part in this ritual. And I was able to talk to the woman who had offered to do smudging on me. And I said, hey, I'm a Christian. Could we pray to Jesus about this instead of, trying to connect in things that I wasn't comfortable with? And she was A-okay with that. And she prayed to Jesus while smudging me, and I prayed to Jesus as well. That was while I was reporting in Merritt, BC, about the Lytton fires that took place last year. But unfortunately, this mom and her children were not given that opportunity to better understand what practice her children were going to be participating in. And that's where the Justice Center of Constitutional Freedoms comes in. And they are appealing, or just appealed, the decision in 2020 that said, we rule in favor of the school board. So I'm going to show you a quick interview here with the lawyer they contracted to take on this recent fight in the Vancouver law courts, the Supreme Court there. Her name is Karen Basteau from David G. Milbourne Trial Lawyers, and she's going to give us the latest on how the hearing went, which has 3 judges who will be ruling over the matter. Take a look. All right, thank you so much. We've got Counsel Karen Basteau, who was in charge, led the charge with the hearing on this case. Thanks for being on Rebel News.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to talk about the case. It was one of the more interesting cases I've done recently.
Oh,
Yes.
and that's why we're covering it for public interest. Now, I gave a little bit of a pretext to, the original way that this became, was getting fought in court. So tell us a little bit about what the grounds for appeal was this
There's
time around.
a couple of grounds of appeal. One of the main grounds of appeal is that the court found that this cleansing, this smudging, this ceremony, this sacred First Nations practice that was carried out in the student classrooms was just a demonstration of a sacred First Nations practice. And we said that was a factual error, and it was an overriding factual error. And there was quite a bit of evidence that wasn't the case, and the judge ignored that evidence. And so we say that it was a sacred practice. It was not a demonstration of a sacred practice, and therefore it offends the duty of the schools to be secular, which is to have no religious practices in the schools, and also something called a state duty of neutrality, which is protected by Section 2A of the Charter, which is the religious freedoms. The state can't profess or adopt specific religious beliefs in a public environment. And this is a public school we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So it's a very unusual event. I'm sure people have kids in public schools, and that there's no religious events pretty much occurring in the schools. Schools are very careful. This was a very unusual event. And it occurred right after a new BC curriculum came into place to integrate First Nations worldviews and practices into the schools. And the teachers did a number of things. They taught history. They taught resource conservation techniques of First Nations. But then they did these very strange things, which is they had the cleansing, and then they had the hoop dance, which is actually a prayer. The entire hoop dance is a prayer, and a prayer was said during the hoop dance. And our client is a Christian, and she got a letter about the cleansing, but only 24 hours before, not in time to opt out her kids. And she got no letter about the hoop dance at all. So she went to court. The second issue on appeal was the trial judge found that these cleansings and the hoop dance were similar to something that happened in Quebec. So in Quebec, the government said, we're going to teach world religions, and we're going to have a course in world religions. We're going to teach them all, and everybody has to take the course. And a bunch of Catholic students went to court taking a course in world religions because ours is the only true religion, and we're not sending our kids to that course. And the Supreme Court of Canada said, well, you are, because there's nothing about teaching a course about all religions that offends the duty of state neutrality or breaches Section 2A of the Charter of Rights. And of course, it's very different in this case. This was not a course. This was a religious ceremony. And even though it's part of the curriculum, the new curriculum to teach First Nations worldviews, our position is it was not necessary to have sacred practices in the school. And there's a lot of case law that says you can't provide for exemptions, because then students get sort of called out by their friends, or why couldn't you attend the ceremony? There's a lot of case law on that. But in those cases, the prayers, they were mostly Christian prayers that were being said, were being done on a daily basis. So in this case, maybe even it would have been sufficient to give the parents an opportunity to opt out, and that was not done. And it was contemplated. So the First Nations education worker that had proposed these ceremonies had drafted a letter so the parents could opt out. And she said this at trial, that was her purpose. And then the principal never sent out the letter. So the basic grounds of appeal are that the case in Quebec is not really the same thing at all. It wasn't any religious ceremony. And the second issue is that the judge can't avoid the issue by saying this was a demonstration of a sacred practice instead of a sacred practice. And that's essentially what the trial court did. It avoided the question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was covering some other things while you were in your hearing. What can you tell us about what took place in court in Vancouver just the other day? And, what was the opposing arguments to what you came to do?
Well, the school board takes the position that the judge was correct in finding it was a demonstration and that it was an educational method that's acceptable, which is it was an experiential. The school board took the position it's experiential education, very healthy for the kids to have experiential education. They learn it better. That was their one position. Their second position was 1/3 of the students were First Nations, and it was a positive for those students to see their culture affirmed in the classrooms. None of those arguments go against what the appellant wanted to happen in her case. She didn't go to court saying there should be no First Nations worldviews or perspectives. And in fact, the appellant did not challenge the curriculum. So she could have brought a challenge and said that this new curriculum that says you have to teach First Nations worldviews and perspectives is unconstitutional. She did not do that. She challenged these two religious practices only. The band, the tribal council intervened, the Nuchanelth, and they were very interesting. They made the point that the duty of reconciliation requires that the schools teach First Nations perspectives and worldviews. And they maintained that the practices were cultural, not religious. So they didn't maintain they were demonstrations. They maintained they were cultural practices and not religious. And the position of the appellant is that the line between culture and religion is a very fine one, and you have to look at the context and what's being said and whether it really is a sacred practice. The Native band takes the position that their practices cannot be defined as religions. They say they are sacred practices within a holistic culture, and they are not a religion. And so that's a big hurdle for the court. The court has to look at the First Nations practices and say, are these in English? If you were speaking English, would this be a religion? And there have been some court cases where smudging, which is what occurred in this case, has been considered a religious practice. Human Rights Tribunal case where a woman wanted to smudge in her apartment. The landlord said you can't. The tribunal said, yes, you can. It's a religious practice. So there have been some cases that support the appellant's position on these sacred practices being akin to a religion. I wouldn't say they are a religion. I would say they are akin to a religion because the Nuchanelth, which is the treaty area that covers about 15 First Nations bands, they say their language has no word for religion, and so their cultural practices.
Well, that's interesting. How does it translate then? And I believe smudging is commonly referred to as a ritual, and depending on what country you're in, a ritual is, sort of tied to religion. What about the word spirituality? I think everybody could agree that such practices have to do with spirituality. Is there any sort of, how does our law handle someone who does spiritual practice and maybe that being children being compelled to do that in school?
Spiritual practices, in order to be a religion, would have to be connected to some systematic set of faith-related beliefs or systematic beliefs. So, I mean, if you said to yourself, and the judge brought up this example, if you went to the top of a mountain and said, oh, I find hiking very spiritually fulfilling, you wouldn't consider that to be a religious statement. So, and the judge actually brought that up as an example. She said, would that be something you couldn't do with the kids? And I said, well, unless that statement was tied systematically to some set of beliefs, that would just be you're just saying in English, I find it spiritually fulfilling to hike to the top of the mountain. But in this case, what was referred to was unseen energies and spirits. And one of the witnesses testified that she felt she connected to her ancestors when she was engaging in this practice. So clearly, this spiritual practice is connected to sort of a matrix of beliefs that would push it towards a definition of religion, unlike the example that the judge gave.
Well, it seems like to me, anyways, I'm not a judge, but there's a definite difference between learning about religion or spirituality and then practicing some form of ritual or whatever that could be perceived either way. So, thanks so much for keeping us up to speed on what happened recently in the case. Any sign? Did the judge preserve judgment? Did he give? Did she give any indication on when a ruling would be made?
The judge is reserved, and I can't say when a ruling will be made, but I think it will take a few months. There was 5,000 pages of case law and materials in this case to go through. There was a lot of Supreme Court of Canada cases, 100 pages long, so there'll be a while.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Karen Bastow, and keep in touch if there's anything else I should let the public know about this case.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Comment below. Let me know what you think about this story. And if you're happy that Rebel News was able to bring it to you, you might want to consider helping to support our independent journalism. You can do so by buying something for yourself. It's a win-win, really, by doing some shopping at our store for some new Rebel-worthy merch, whether it be a mug, a cell phone case, or clothing at rebelnewsstore.com. I'm Drea Humphrey, and this is Rebel News.